Welcome to Mayor Brown's International Arbitration Across the Pond podcast. Each episode is designed to provide insight on legal issues and other matters affecting international arbitration in the UK, US and around the world. The podcast is presented by two of Mayor Brown's international arbitration partners, Kwadwo from the firm's London office and Charles Harris from the firm's Chicago office. You can subscribe to this podcast on all major podcasting platforms, as well as Mayor Brown's YouTube channel. We hope you enjoy the podcast.
Welcome to the Across the Pond podcast, where we dive deep into the world of international arbitration. Back from our voyage to space, for this second episode of Series 2, Chucky and I will be turning our focus to the Middle East. The region is home to some of the world's most fast expanding and rapidly diversifying economies. It's a powerhouse for sectors such as energy, technology and construction, with its economic dynamism driving a surge in cross-border transactions. This, of course, inevitably brings the prospect of complex disputes, which often demand sophisticated dispute resolution mechanisms. And so it's in that vein that we're thrilled to be joined today by two distinguished guests, who we also both count as colleagues and friends, and each of whom bring a wealth of expertise and experience with regard to international arbitration and the Middle East. First, I'm delighted to introduce Gerard Moore. Hi, Gerard.
Hi, Kwadwo.
Gerard is a partner in the Mayor Brown Dubai office. He's a leading figure in the field of international arbitration, and his work frequently involves matters with a Middle Eastern nexus. And I've personally worked alongside him on Middle Eastern arbitrations, and so can certainly vouch for his ability to navigate the region's unique legal and commercial landscape. Also joining us is Andrew Sarraf. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Kwadwo. Hi, Chucky.
Hello.
Andrew is a Mayor Brown associate who, while based in the London office, has a flourishing Middle Eastern practice. So in this episode, we'll explore how arbitration sits within the Middle East's unique legal landscape, what it means for parties considering or currently involved in disputes in the region, and along the way, we'll be looking to unpack some of the most pressing questions facing practitioners. But first order of business, what's our episode title going to be? Chucky, any suggestions?
Look, I was off my job. I've been busy over the past couple of days, but you stole my thunder from what I so I'll turn it back to you to give a title.
Well, my working title at the moment, and I'll invite comments from our distinguished guests, but this is going to be Across the Pond, the Middle East Files.
Which I like that.
Andrew, Gerard?
Good. I think it sounds good.
Yeah, sounds very mysterious.
Yeah.
Right.
Fantastic. And hopefully we can unravel some of those mysteries on this episode right now. So leaping straight into the questions, Gerard and Andrew, each in turn, I'll start with you, Gerard. Can you tell us a little bit about your arbitration practice, the types of disputes you typically handle, and a bit of background? What drew you to this field?
Sure, thanks, Kwadwo. Well, I'll start in reverse order. So I really got into construction law, right at the beginning of my legal career. I did that as someone when I was training back in Australia. And then I came out to the Middle East because it is the place you want to be a construction lawyer for obvious reasons. There's massive projects going on here that are of a huge scale. And when you're a construction lawyer in the Middle East, that often means you're a construction disputes lawyer, which often means you're a construction arbitration lawyer. And so that's what I do now. I work in large-scale disputes, mainly in the construction engineering sectors. And, I do everything in those sectors. So airports, railways, hospitals, power plants, desalination plants, large mixed use and residential development projects, as well as oil and gas and energy projects, as you can imagine.
Fantastic, Gerard. And Andrew, are you able to give us a bit of your background?
Yeah, of course. So similarly to Gerard, I'm also qualified in Australia. So also Melbourne, I think like Gerard. My early beginnings into the law, unlike Gerard, were not focused on construction. I did a lot of commercial litigation, kind of general contractual / commercial disputes. And my last few years before I moved to London, I was doing a bit of defending class action work. So I was always quite attracted to the litigious side of the law. The strategy and the advocacy that's kind of attached to that really attracted me and drew my attention. When I relocated to London in 2018, I found that there was a really big international arbitration market that was focusing on work in the Middle East and especially in construction. And my background is Lebanese. I grew up for a number of years and graduated high school in Lebanon. I speak Arabic fluently and can read it very, very well. So I was drawn to the field, and to be quite honest, the field was quite drawn to me. They were looking for lawyers who had Arabic skills, could read and understand the decisions, and could culturally fit in the area. So I very shortly after moving to London in 2018, I started working in international arbitration with a focus on construction disputes in the Middle East. At that time, Qatar was huge, kind of pre-World Cup, and there was a lot of work and disputes going on in that region. And over time, the work's really just developed more across the entire region, the UAE, Saudi Arabia. Big focus on construction, but like Gerard, also energy, oil and gas, and the like, and the odd commercial arbitration that comes up as well.
Okay, so thanks both Gerard and Andrew. So it's interesting what you just said about the growth, I assume, of arbitration in the Middle East. One of the things we wanted to understand, because as we go to move along in this discussion, is what is the legal system in the Middle East, and how amenable is it to arbitration? And I mean that from both an enforcement and a litigation standpoint. And that question is for either or both of you.
Yeah. Well, look, there is the local court system, which is based upon the local civil laws, and with a heavy influence of Sharia law, obviously. It is, as you can imagine, all proceedings conducted in Arabic. And arbitration really runs alongside that as an alternative dispute resolution method, and the main dispute resolution method. It's recognized as being exceptional, so it's something that parties have to expressly agree to, and usually in writing. And there are some other issues about authority and things like that, which parties need to be conscious of. But it's definitely an area of dispute resolution which has quite heavy support across the region. Practically all of the countries across the region have adopted national arbitration laws which are based upon the UN model law, which means that they're firmly in line with international best practice, particularly when it comes to, I guess, the enforcement stage of things, with very prescribed grounds for challenging the enforcement of awards, as well as prescribed procedures. There are some differences. There is, the public policy exception or ground of challenge, I should say. And in this region, that often means things that are inherently within the bounds of either personal relationships, so things that are kind of non-arbitrable, things that are within the remit of governments, and then also things, as I said before, which are Sharia non-compliant. So often you see that in terms of interest being awarded under arbitral awards, and that is often a ground of challenge, or at least partial challenge as well. So all of that is to say that arbitration is fairly well supported in the region. It is relatively prevalent as a means of resolving disputes for commercial disputes, construction definitely, and energy, which I think is probably something we can delve into a little bit more. So Andrew, obviously, feel free to add anything you wanted to on that.
Yeah, I agree with everything Gerard said. Just to add, most of the Arab countries have also signed up to the New York Convention. So kind of enforcement across borders and the like is readily available to international parties. I think the region over the last, especially in certain countries like Saudi Arabia, where we're seeing a huge increase in the number of arbitrations that are being filed. So, for example, the SCCA, which is, the leading body for arbitration in Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Center for Commercial Arbitration, in 2022, in their report, they said they had over 150% increase in the number of arbitrations filed from 2021. And even in Saudi, for example, arbitration's become a huge trend where I think it was maybe around 15 years ago, most government entities were not allowed to enter into arbitration agreements with say contractors unless expressly authorized by the minister. Now a number of them are required by law to actually enter into arbitration agreements for big projects, especially with international contractors. So we're seeing a huge trend. It's, I think, designed to attract more international contractors, large reputable contractors to undertake work in the region. I think there's a tendency for it now to be seen as a little bit more neutral and just more attractive to the international contractors entering the space and doing significant work in the region.
So in what language are arbitrations in the Middle East usually conducted? I mean, because
I think predominantly what we tend to see in our experience is arbitrations being conducted in English, at least on pretty big projects where the counterparty is an international contractor. That's usually the tendency. That being said, I was involved last year in 2 arbitrations in Saudi Arabia, one of which actually went to a final hearing where the contract stipulated that the language of the arbitration was going to be in Arabic. And me, along with one of the partners here in our London office, Raid Abu Manna, who's also a native Arabic speaker like me, we did the advocacy, and we had our co-counsel, which is the local firm that we work with in Saudi Arabia, called Al Akil and Partners. They had one of their senior associates also doing the advocacy with us in Arabic. And that was a little bit unusual and challenging for us because we had to go and find delay and quantum experts from reputable international companies that could speak Arabic, produce reports in Arabic, could readily be cross-examined in the language. But we are seeing some contracts with government entities or even subcontracts, where the language is in Arabic.
Oh, that's really interesting, Andrew. And what particularly grabbed me was a bit earlier when you were talking about the huge increase, and I think 150% plus for the SCCA you mentioned. So that's really quite telling, and it does indicate a pretty dramatic increase in the uptake and acceptance culturally, I suppose, of international arbitration. But with regard to sectors, and I suspect some of these will be some of the sectors, energy, oil and gas, and so on, that you mentioned in some of the earlier discussion. But which are the key sectors driving this rise of arbitration in the region? And are you able to dig down for us a little bit into trends within those sectors which are pushing the increase?
Yeah, look, it's definitely construction and energy are driving the increase in arbitration. Those sectors, as we said before, have always tended to arbitrate their disputes, but they're really the 2 leading economic forces at the moment in this region, and so they're continuing to drive that. And as Andrew said, particularly in a place like Saudi, arbitration on these large construction projects that are being built as part of the Vision 2030, the ones that we've all seen and read about with in Neom with the line and Trojena and things like that. Those all mandate SEC arbitration as part of their dispute resolution methods. Now, but it goes beyond that. I mean, I'm seeing in my non-construction and energy practice more and more arbitration clauses as well. So I've been working on some commercial joint venture disputes, which again have arbitration as the dispute resolution method. Similarly with the distribution agreements, so international companies wanting to sell goods in this region will typically have a local distributor. Those are often and increasingly now providing for arbitration as a dispute resolution method. Interestingly as well, they're also providing for non-local law in a lot of cases as well, which I think is reflective of a desire to appeal to the foreign investors to do business in the region. And similarly in things like M&A and fintech agreements as well, lots of arbitration clauses there. And with a variety of different rules and also different seats, both regionally and also internationally, which I think is just reflective of a growing familiarity with and comfort with arbitration. But also, I think particularly in terms of the choices of the different rules and the different seats as well, just much more increased sophistication on behalf of both parties to the transactions, and I think it's very an interesting development, but also encouraging for the international arbitration market and international arbitration practitioners like Andrew and myself.
So if I can follow up on one thing you said, Gerard. So it seemed like you were saying that traditionally arbitrations were governed by the local civil laws, but you see that kind of changing now that more folks are, I guess, entering supply agreements and other things.
Yeah, look, it really depends upon the nature of the underlying commercial transaction, right? So Andrew will agree with me that almost all of the construction disputes we work on are governed by local law, and that's I think that's in part because the local civil laws do have special provisions in them that deal specifically with construction contracts. And so in that case, it's not necessary to look outside of the region for your substantive law to govern your disputes. In the energy sector, typically, not always, but typically English law has been the governing law of choice because that has, a lot of those projects have typically required very highly specialized or, engineering firms from outside the region to work on those projects. And they've had a lot more bargaining power in order to get, a neutral substantive law to resolve their disputes. But increasingly, you see that outside of, I think particularly in the more purely commercial transactions like M&A, like distributor agreements, again, as well, you're seeing alternatives to the local law. And one thing I should probably mention as well is yes, there are local civil laws which are based upon, the Napoleonic civil codes, France, Egypt, and then in this region has generally been the adoption with the local Sharia flavor. But there are 2 or 3, I should say, specific jurisdictions in the region, being the Dubai International Financial Center, the Abu Dhabi Global Market, and also the Qatar Financial Center, which have their own specific laws based on the English common law, and they also have their own courts as well. But those laws are all in English, and they have things like the doctrine of precedent and things like that, which and they actually rely upon the English common law in order for their guidance to courts there. So the reason why I mention that is you'll often have commercial parties choosing DIFC law as a bit of a halfway house for as a substantive law for their commercial disputes. And I should say each of those financial centers, the 3 common law islands in a sea of civil law, they all have their own separate arbitration laws. So you can choose those jurisdictions as your seat for arbitration, which again, something I'm seeing. I'm working on a project at the moment. It's a desalination plant project in the Middle East. The governing law is English law. The seat is the DIFC, and the rules are the ICC arbitration rules. So clearly, a lot of thought has gone into that from both parties, and despite the fact that one of them is a local entity, and there's been a willingness and a sophistication about the seat and the substantive laws that they've chosen to resolve their disputes on those transactions.
Thanks very much, Gerard. So one thing you touched on was, for instance, the DIFC and so on, and their contribution to the commercial landscape. What I'm also interested in hearing about is local arbitration centres and institutions. How do these provide a framework and support for arbitration, and how often are they used in relation to arbitrations in the region?
I think it depends to some extent on the jurisdiction that you find yourself in and which countries, the contracts are arising out of. So in the UAE, and Gerard can probably comment on this a little bit more given his presence in the region. But I find, you do find a number of arbitrations that do go locally to the DIFC or kind of the regional institutions. But there's also a trend to use the ICC, the LCIA, some of the more typical international institutions in some of the contracts. And in my experience, I've tended to see a little bit of a mix there. In Saudi Arabia, and given that I think arbitration is relatively newer there, at least as a forum that is being used quite regularly, most of the contracts that I tend to see coming out of Saudi Arabia rely almost exclusively on the Saudi Center for Commercial Arbitration as being the dispute resolution center or institution that's going to manage and govern the dispute. Now, in terms of the adoption of, say, arbitration in Saudi Arabia, I personally think that's quite a good thing, because the rules that the SCCA has adopted are kind of in line with international good practice, fairly similar to the rules of procedure that you would tend to see with institutions like the ICC and LCIA. They've got a multilingual body and administrators that, at least in the experience I've had working on a few SCCA cases now, seem to be quite experienced, quite knowledgeable, and they have a pool of arbitrators that they can call upon that are actually quite international as well in nature. So they have domestic Saudi arbitrators, but they've got a pool of international arbitrators as well. A few months ago, for example, when I went to Paris Arbitration Week, the SCCA hosted a talk and rented out a really big room, and it was one of the highest attended talks I think I attended during Paris Arbitration Week. The room was packed to the point that we all had to kind of stand at the back and shuffle around, and it was quite warm that day, I remember as well. So and there was a huge amount of interest, and it wasn't just local or regional practitioners that were keen to attend. There was a huge international presence there of Europeans and Americans and the like. They were quite keen to attend and learn more about the way that the SCCA is growing, the amount of cases that they're bringing in, and just kind of the growth and trajectory of that region. So yeah, that's kind of my take, at least on the Saudi aspect. I don't know if Gerard wants to comment a little bit more locally in the UAE as well, for example.
Yeah, no, I think Andrew has hit the nail on the head there with Saudi. I think one thing I just add to that is, I think there's a perception that in terms of arbitration friendliness, Saudi has kind of lagged behind quite a bit. But if you actually look at the things that they've done, in the last 15 years to encourage and really support arbitration in the kingdom, in many ways, they've been a bit more, even more advanced than the UAE, which has been seen as the real hub. So, for example, they had a model arbitration law that was in line with best practice before the UAE did. The SCCA rules, sorry, I should say that DIAC, the Dubai International Arbitration Center, released some rules in 2022, the first change in 15 years, and they provided for a lot of really modern arbitration procedures, including things like expedited procedures, but also emergency arbitrator procedures. Now, the SCCA rules actually had emergency arbitrator procedures and expedited procedures 4 years before that in 2018. So that's not to talk down about DIAC, because they are the institution I'm most familiar with. But I think it's more to talk up what's been happening in Saudi, that actually, the support that's been going, or the work that's been put in to support arbitration has been going on for quite a long time.
Oh, thanks very much, gents. So, Gerard, you just touched there on arbitration friendliness. And for me, certainly, a key aspect or dimension of that is enforcement, and how effectively can awards be enforced, how effectively can arbitration agreements be upheld, and so on. Are the two of you able to share some of your experiences of the challenges and or opportunities in relation to enforcement, specifically in the Middle East, and then comparing that to other regions?
Thanks, Kwadwo. Yeah, when I first arrived in the UAE about 10 years ago, there were unfortunately rather frequent horror stories about challenges to enforcement, or successful challenges to enforcement on very, very spurious grounds. I think one thing that's always, thankfully that's improved over time, but one thing that's always remained a very unique potential ground of challenge here in the UAE and right across the Middle East, in fact, is a question of authority. I mentioned earlier that arbitration is seen as an exceptional method of resolving disputes, which means that anyone agreeing to arbitrate on behalf of a company, for example, has to have a specific authority designated to them to bind that company to arbitration. So even signing a contract that contains an arbitration clause, the person who does that needs to have the specific authority either delegated to them in, a memorandum of association, incorporation documents, or more often than not through a power of attorney. And that can really trip people up, not just when it comes to entering into an arbitration agreement, but in terms of things like appointing attorneys as well. You need the person who appoints the attorneys also has to have the same authority, and similarly, appointing tribunals, and even when it comes to giving tribunals the authority to award costs, legal costs to a party, because that's another thing that's not a given under the national arbitration laws in this region. And that's something, those are two things we just take for granted in countries like the UK or the US or Australia, that, we have doctrine of apparent authority. And of course, you can claim legal costs when you're incurring legal fees. So those are two things I think that very unique things that I've seen that have resulted in successful challenges to awards, at least in part, particularly on the question of costs.
Thank you, Gerard. And Andrew, any experience?
I think what Gerard has said is quite right. I think historically there were more concerns around the enforceability of arbitration awards in Middle Eastern countries, and I think a part of that came out of the general inexperience of the local courts with arbitration, and the judicial system that the local courts had with dealing with arbitration awards. So some of the challenges that would go to the courts would be along, say an authority ground or something like that, and then the local courts would, or a judge would listen to these arguments and might set aside an award in full or in part on these types of arguments, which, as we all know, if you've spent a number of years pursuing an arbitration and expending significant costs could be quite frustrating. And that, I think, for some time led to, a lack of confidence with the arbitration system. I think, fortunately, in the Middle East, we see this less and less now, and that's due to the adoption, as Gerard also mentioned, a number of arbitration acts or legislations within many of the countries that kind of are consistent with international arbitration best practice. Like I said before, many of the countries have signed up to the New York Convention, so enforceability has improved dramatically as a result of that. But I also think just the local courts and the judges that sit there and need to eventually sign the orders in order to give you the ability to go and enforce your award have just become more and more accustomed to the system. The governments of each of the countries have tended to adopt it more. There's been a larger education, and also they've just become more. They've managed to deal more and more with international arbitrators, international practitioners. There's been a growing trend of bringing in international arbitrators to sit alongside local arbitrators, and I think this has just kind of increased the confidence that you should have as a party or as an international practitioner who is, say, preparing a contract that's considering the option of adopting either arbitration or the local courts as a dispute resolution mechanism under a contract.
So thank you for that. You actually answered my next question. So I'll skip that. So I'm sure the Middle East has pretty unique both cultural and commercial practices. If you can give us just a little bit about what those are and also how those practices affect arbitration.
Yeah, maybe I'll take this one first, and I don't actually know if this is really a reflection of a cultural difference, but maybe just reflective of the attitude a little bit towards arbitration. But I think, I guess oftentimes, what I've seen a lot of is, you've got an award, you actually managed to get it enforced, and really then that's the starting point from which you negotiate. Usually, a bit of a haircut as well. In fact, I was just involved in a case where I was acting for a party. They'd been really a non-participant in a foreign arbitration. The award creditor took his foreign award, came to the UAE to enforce it here, because this is where the award creditor was the award debtor was based. They had a fight about enforcement. The award debtor challenged the award as well on really numerous grounds. That challenge failed, and then a year after the enforcement proceedings were started, the parties sat down and did a deal over a couple of months, and that generally, and that specifically, I should say, resulted in a negotiated settlement sum that was significantly less than the awarded amount. And this is a project that was completed in 2020, so 5 years after the fact. And that's not something I really saw back in my home jurisdiction, although that was a number of years ago now, so maybe things have moved on a bit. But that was, I think, kind of the main kind of cultural difference to at least compliance with awards that I've noticed since being out here.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that. I mean, I think in the Middle East, it's never too late to start negotiating, even after there's an award against you. But it's
like being in the souk, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly right. So, but there are a couple of other kind of commercial and cultural norms, I think, in the region that play a bit of a role in how this all kind of shapes up. So a lot of the investment, I think, that you tend to see in Middle Eastern countries are driven by sovereign wealth funds, or public investment funds, as they're known. And so a lot of the infrastructure projects that are funded by the country or the government are actually on the other side. It's either the sovereign wealth fund itself or an entity that is, wholly or largely owned by the sovereign wealth fund. And I've seen or been involved in a few matters where, on the other side, you've got a contractor where one of the significant investors is also the same sovereign wealth fund, and then trying to marry that up when there's a significant dispute worth, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, but there's a reluctance from the parties to actually go to arbitration to begin with, because you've got effectively the same investor sitting on both sides of the dispute, and they obviously don't want to spend money in a dispute against itself. So there's this kind of unusual dynamic and tension that I don't think you see in many, say, Western countries, for example. And then there's also the other aspect where, in circumstances where most of the projects are coming by way of a sovereign wealth fund or the government itself, there's also a reluctance to initiate an arbitration. Sometimes we see against that party, because you're then worried as a contractor that you won't get another project from that country again in the future if you commence arbitration proceedings against them. So even where you feel like you've got a good, legitimate claim, you might be inclined to take a significant haircut on it for the fear that you might not get another project in that country in the future. So these tensions and dynamics do exist, I think, a bit more in the Middle East than some of the other countries where I've practiced before.
Look, guys, so yeah, it seems that although arbitration progresses effectively, it's well supported, it does seem that still parties need to be prepared to negotiate and be prepared to perhaps take a bit of a hit in order to achieve an overall settlement, using arbitration as one of the tools in the overall toolkit to get the outcome that they're seeking.
Yeah, I think that's right. And we see a lot of the independent dispute resolution processes under the contract, and those are quite attractive in the Middle East, even in the circumstances that I've mentioned, because even though they're non-binding, we've seen parties kind of take them on board before, and where the findings are quite, say, favorable to one party over the other, that then creates a huge motivation and impetus to come to a commercial resolution that both parties, might not love, but can quite easily live with, to be honest.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Andrew.
And just on that as well, across the region, you can see that mediation, a lot of investment is being made into mediation as a dispute resolution process, and it is being driven from the top down by government, because this is all coming from particularly the arbitration institutions, so the SCCA, DIAC as well, and also Arbitrate AD in Abu Dhabi. They have recently issued all their own mediation rules, and mediation processes as well. The DIFC courts have also just about to adopt a new mediation center as well. And things tend to happen in this region when they're driven from the top down, when the imprimatur comes down from the government to say, we're going to start doing X, Y, Z. And mediation is definitely, you can tell, it's definitely being pushed. And as someone who did a lot of mediation before I came out here, I think that's really positive. I think it's a great way to resolve disputes and to force the parties to sit down together and try and hammer out a deal. And I think, I think it's actually going to be good for the arbitration practice, because it's going to give us, as you say, Kwadwo, an extra toolkit as practitioners to help our clients actually resolve their disputes, because ultimately that's what we're being paid for.
Absolutely. So, gents, you've talked about lots of exciting developments in relation to Middle Eastern arbitration. It sounds incredibly exciting. If you could each pick one development that excites you most, it could be something you've discussed already or something that we've missed and is entirely new. But if I could invite each of you to pick one, starting with you, Andrew.
I think probably what excites me the most about the use of arbitration in the region is just the extent to which it's becoming increasingly accepted and adopted, and the extent to which we're starting to see more and more international practitioners entering the market, and working alongside with the local practitioners in the region, and kind of there's a good sharing, I think, of knowledge and tools and resources, where I think, as Western qualified practitioners, we're bringing in a good skill set in terms of, a large history of international arbitration, many years of practice, rules, seeing what's gone well, what's gone wrong, and introducing that into the region. But in line, the region itself is educating us when we come in on the local law customs, the Sharia law customs that we need to get up to scratch with. And I think we're starting to see a good merger between the Western kind of practices alongside the Middle Eastern legal sector that's existed for a very long time. So I find that very exciting, especially as a Arab-speaking, Western-trained practitioner. To me, that's very, very appealing.
Right in the sweet spot.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, honestly, I think the thing I'm most excited about is potentially having the opportunity to work on some of the, world's biggest and most complex disputes arising out of, everything that's going on in the region, particularly the massive and quite groundbreaking projects that are taking place in Saudi for Vision 2030, as well as all the other interesting things that are going on in the region, particularly in the UAE with their desire to be a real international AI hub, and all of the associated commercial disputes that could arise out of that, not just to do with tech contracts and things like that, but also just the infrastructure, the building of the data centers, and all the significant amounts of energy that's going to have to go into supporting those as well. I think that's what's exciting is that we're in a region and in a practice area with potentially huge amount of opportunity.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, absolutely agree. These are extremely exciting times and an extremely exciting part of the world. So, last question from me, gents, as we begin to draw to a close. If you could redesign any aspect of international arbitration in the Middle East, and be that the rules, be that some of the cultural norms you've touched on, or anything else, what would you change and why?
I can start if you like. So this notion that I touched, I think till now is a little bit of I want to say maybe a power disparity in terms of the relationship between, say, an employer and a contractor. I think in a number of jurisdictions in the Middle East, where I think a contractor, quite typically, especially if they're a regional or local contractor, has a huge reluctance to initiate arbitration proceedings against an employer because of the fear that they might not get another project in the country again, or of certain consequences that might flow into different projects that they might be operating in the region. And that is something that we've seen, and I don't think we see that to the same extent in, say, the UK or in the USA or in some of these other jurisdictions, even in Asia. So and I think over time that's potentially something that will change and develop with time and more adoption of arbitration by the local governments and sovereign wealth funds and the like. But yeah, if I could accelerate progress in one particular area, for me, it would probably be that.
Thank you. And Gerard, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, my final thought is that I would like to see the speed and efficiency of international arbitration in this region increase massively. I think that is always I think that's the number one turnoff that I hear from clients, that it just takes too long, and therefore it costs too much money. And I think if we can speed up the arbitration process as practitioners as well, I think we have a lot of power in that regard. So if we can do that as practitioners, then that will encourage our clients to actually use arbitration to pursue their rights. and they'll see much more value for money out of it, and ultimately, we will get a greater volume of work. It'll be great for us, but it'll be even better for our clients, because they won't be sitting on a big black hole in their financials for several years, waiting to get their arbitration to slowly grind to its final conclusion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gerard. And yeah, wholeheartedly agree. I think, yeah, the speed and expense, which is often related to the speed of progress, is the repeated number one concern, and that's in jurisdictions across the world. And I also agree that us as practitioners, we have the potential to be part of the solution, but if we're not careful, we can also be part of the problem. So yeah, I certainly wholeheartedly endorse your objectives and suggestions around how actually, if we work to make things faster, it leads to more work for us overall.
So I learned a lot today. I'm sure you did too, Kwadwo. So thank both of you for enlightening us on what's going on in the Middle East in our arbitration space.
Yes, Gerard, Andrew, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts with us, with our audience. Yeah, really learnt a lot. And so that closes the Middle East Files and this episode 2 of Series 2. But yeah, thank you very much, Chucky. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. Goodbye.
Thanks, Quadge. Thanks, Chuck. Thanks, Andrew. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you all a lot. It's been great. Real pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you have any suggestions for topics or want to reach Kwadwo Sarkodie or Charles Harris, you can find them at the Mayer Brown website, mayerbrown.com. Also, to learn more about other Mayer Brown audio programs, please visit mayerbrown.com/podcasts. Thank you for listening.